Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Conspiracy, cock-up, or something altogether different? I don't know anymore. Do you? Home Secretary, one of the great offices of state, a position that should really be invested with all of the prestige and respect that an office of state can be invested with, sat in front of a House of Commons Select Committee yesterday and pleaded complete ignorance of something which the same committee had heard fairly definitive proof of just moments previously. I'm going live. Oh, I already have, actually. You may have noticed. I don't know quite what angle we're going to take on this because, somewhat to my own surprise, I don't know who steers on days like today. It also, at risk of biting off more than we can chew, even with both our mouths chomping away, it also, I think, allows for one cautious insight into the ongoing anti-Semitism problem. All right, mate, go on then, knit all that together. Well, I think a lot of the Labour Party's problems with anti-Semitism stem from the perception of a lot of Jeremy Corbyn's supporters and a lot of what you'd call harder left voters and activists, that the British media is horribly skewed and biased. And the funny thing is that they're right. The British media is in large part horribly skewed and biased to do the bidding of its rich owners. We know that, don't we? Because, look, we're leaving the European Union. We're about to get a hell of a lot poorer and probably carve up the NHS so that people who are already rich can get even richer, while telling the rest of us to blame the fact that we're getting poorer on immigrants, which isn't a project that's been undertaken with almost complete success by newspapers like the Daily Mail, the Daily Express, the Daily Telegraph and the Sun. The anti-elite is the beauty of it, isn't it? So they're right, these people, when they talk of a horribly biased media. And it is horribly biased against everything from trades unions, which protect workers, foreigners, and even the vaguest suggestion of the lightest redistribution of wealth. You know, politics of envy, champagne socialism. That's the formula. This isn't even an opinion. No one's going to dispute this. You open up a newspaper, massive majority of British media, and tell me what it tries to teach you about trades unions, foreigners, and distribution of wealth. The problem is, it's got nothing to do with Jews. If a couple of media organisations happen to be owned by people from a certain faith, it would be as daft to describe... Isn't Rupert Murdoch a Catholic? I think isn't he a Catholic? Didn't he have to get a special dispensation from the Pope to get divorced from his first wife? Or maybe his wife was a Catholic. But anyway, I digress. The point is, no one would ever dream of claiming that Rupert Murdoch's Catholicism somehow lay behind his attempt to manipulate the British public into acting against their own interests in order to make men like him richer and more powerful than they are already. That seems to me to be the problem. I wasn't intending to go in on this. We're going in on Amber Rudd, but you know what I'm like. I've got this almost obsessive desire to understand stuff. And I still struggle to understand the gulf between people who think the Labour Party have got a problem with anti-Semitism and people who think the Labour Party hasn't. Truth lies somewhere between the two. I'll remind you of the YouGov polling we looked at yesterday that has seen the number of Labour supporters, people voting Labour, who tick boxes that speak of anti-Semitism, that's gone down during Jeremy Corbyn's leadership. YouGov polled in 2015, polled again in 2017, and it had gone down. It also showed that conservative voters were more likely across the board to subscribe to anti-Semitic attitudes than Labour supporters were. But this isn't about voters and supporters, it's about activists. And that's it, isn't it? They see, every time they see a biased media, and they would, of course, then move into coverage of Israel and particularly Palestine. But every time they see a biased media doing the bidding of rich media owners, they see proof of their beliefs that there's some sort of Jewish conspiracy to control the masses. And they are horribly, horribly wrong, but they don't think that they're anti-Semitic because they think that they're just describing reality, and they've got evidence for their beliefs, even if they don't actually prove their beliefs. Every time they see a story that's demonising decency or encouraging racism, you know, the managing editor of The Sun, whose watch under whose watch the headline "We Need Less Islam" appeared, sat before a select committee 2 days ago and denied that the Sun had anything to do with spreading negativity towards Islam. You really do some mornings wonder whether you've gone nuts. So that's probably why we won't talk about anti-Semitism today, because it seems to be reaching a point where, we talked about it a lot yesterday, where it's being turned into a weapon to probably slightly obfuscate the truth, obfuscate reality. I don't know. That's just my thoughts. Is the media is horribly biased, but it's got nothing to do with Jewishness. The problem I have today is this, and I need your help a bit with this, because who leads now? Who leads political journalism? The BBC seems to me, having worked there a little bit and having decided that I can't anymore, it seems to me to be cowed. It seems to me to be frightened of the government. And that would explain some very strange attitudes to guests talking about Brexit, but also some very strange choices, perhaps, about what is the most important story in the news. In terms of British politics, a Home Secretary not knowing what's going on in her own Home Office, or a Prime Minister who, as Home Secretary, knowingly introduced policies that would terrorise innocent elderly British people, that seems to me to be huge. I look for things that we could describe as proof that we hold everybody to the same standards, and 10 minutes after 10 is the time. I can't find any evidence of that anymore. We don't hold people to the same standards. We just don't. It's really, really weird. It reaches its apotheosis with Donald Trump, of course. Lots of people who claim to be Christians are cheering for a self-confessed sex offender. It's just weird, right? Oh, yeah, he's great. He's standing up for Christian values by reportedly having sex with a pornographic actress while his wife are practically still in the Labour ward. Oh, yeah, Christian. So do you see what I mean? If Hillary Clinton did this, if Donald Trump did that. There was a story yesterday, Jacob Rees-Mogg, wasn't he, a couple of days ago, was talking about burning down the House of Lords. Now, he was speaking metaphorically. Only an idiot would pretend otherwise. Or an editor of the Daily Mail would pretend otherwise if it had been said by an 18-year-old who was protesting against something like, I don't know, a statue in a college quadrangle of someone who'd made his fortune out of slavery. We have completely lost consensus on decency and standards. And most of the blame for that lies with my profession. Two politicians of completely different hues should be judged the same on certain issues, moral and professional. So if a politician from the Labour Party or the Conservative Party does something immoral, they should be judged the same. I find Keith Vass's continuing residence in the House of Commons very odd. But equally, if a Conservative MP had been caught doing what Keith Vass was caught doing, I'd wonder whether he or she should have resigned as well. And that's morally. Politically, if I mean, it's a while now since we've had a Labour Home Secretary, but if a Labour Home Secretary didn't know what was going on in their own department, you would expect blood on the proverbial carpet. And yet much of the British media is sort of either hoping or facilitating Amber Rudd either Amber Rudd and Theresa May getting off the hook, or if one of them ends up having to carry the can, despite the best efforts of the Daily Mail to make you think about plastic, of the Daily Telegraph to make you think about Jeremy Corbyn's anti-Semitism problems, or of what's the Sun trying to get you to think about today? Prince William falling asleep in a memorial service. So they're trying very hard not to let you think about how the hell a Home Secretary could be so clearly ignorant of stuff, A, introduced by her predecessor, who's now Prime Minister, and B, going on in her own department. It might work, but if it does work, where does it leave us? If you can introduce policies that persecute innocent people and not get punished, what has happened to British politics? Do you know what I think I want you to do today? I think I want you to calm me down. I think I want you to just hold my hand for a while and say, no, it's not that dark, it's not that bad, it's not that crazy, don't be daft, don't be soft. A Prime Minister can introduce policies that persecute innocent people and go unpunished. Now, that's why the language I'm using is quite carefully chosen. It shouldn't matter whether it's a Conservative Prime Minister, a Communist Prime Minister or a Labour Prime Minister. If the person in charge of the country can be proven to have known that things she was doing would persecute innocent people, what if you're an innocent person, how can you not be up in arms about that? Well, I'm a white innocent person, James. Is it that simple? I don't know. And I don't even know if the Amber Rudd business yesterday is as simple as some people are portraying it. Should we hear first from the head of the union that looks after border guards on this question of targets for removal? And a few people will already be thinking, well, I don't care if they've got targets to remove people who are here illegally, but the single most important lesson we've learned in the last 10 days, you heard it on this actual programme, didn't you? On the day that all this started breaking, when we spoke to a 75-year-old woman suffering from cancer, cared for by her son, and her son had been essentially issued with a removal notice. It probably wasn't actually a Windrush issue, but it was a very humanitarian issue, given that she'd lived here all her life and she wanted her son to look after her. And this makes sense to me now. It didn't at the time. Ozzy explained to us that he was going to buy his own ticket. He was going to buy his own ticket rather than be deported. Now, that's a voluntary removal. So, by all means, say, oh, I don't care if they're removing illegal immigrants. But you heard that young man, and you heard his mother's desperation, and you know that the Home Office has acted to enable him to stay, and you know that a lot of people caught up in the Windrush scandal have the right to be here, but left or didn't come back from Jamaica because they couldn't prove that right under the laws, under the rules brought in by Theresa May. 0345 6060 973 is the number that you need. Here's Lucy Morton, yesterday, the Director General of the union which represents border control and immigration staff.
We see more and more challenging targets, starting with the announcement of the net migration target that is translated down through the operational arms of the Home Office to a certain number of decisions made within 180 days, unless they are exceptionally complicated. A net removals target that enforcement teams have to meet, so they are aiming to remove a certain number of individuals in any given month reported.
How can you have a quota if you don't know what the scale of the problem is? I don't know. And then here's Amber Rudd.
Targets for removals, when were they set?
We don't have targets for removals.
But you did.
I don't know what are you referring to?
We just heard from the previous evidence that the Home Office and there are regional targets for net removals.
I didn't hear the testimony. I'm not sure what shape that might be in. But if you're asking me are the numbers of people we expect to be removed, that's not how we operate. I do think it is right. I know we're talking about Windrush here, who are legal migrants, but where there are people who are here illegally, it is right that we do try to remove them.
Okay, we have just had testimony in our evidence session that has been very clear that there are removals targets in place. Perhaps Mr. Williams could clarify. Are there removals targets for different regions of the enforcement team?
I'm not in charge of enforcement, but not as far as I know, no.
Okay, so we've just had very clear evidence. So I think we're going to need to clear this up pretty quickly, because if there are removals targets in the Home Office and the two people who are supposedly in charge don't know about them, then that feels pretty serious and feels like a kind of lack of grip anywhere in the system. If there aren't, obviously, I don't want to be putting unfair questions to you. But
to clarify what was said to us, I mean, was it a target based on a number or a percentage? I mean, it is correct that I have asked for more removals to take place, because I would like to see people who are here illegally removed.
Mr. Doughty?
It was a very clear point from the Immigration Services Union, who said there were net removals targets by region across the UK. So we need to know if that is true or not.
Number?
Well, net removals target, you would assume, is a number of people that you are trying to remove from a region. And we were told about the wider impact of the net migration policy and how that filters down to KPIs and targets for individual decision makers, both in terms of removals, processing times and so on. It's very clear this is having an impact on day-to-day decision making.
Okay, well, I'll certainly take a look at the testimony that you've been given.
And now we've got a report from December 2015, which makes Amber Rudd's position even more uncomfortable. It's 18 minutes after 10. Look, I'm going to be quite unprofessional, all right? And I'm going to treat you as my equal, as I always do on this programme. And I'm just going to say I don't understand. I genuinely don't understand why both of these women are still in post as these stories unfold and emerge. What's your explanation for why presiding over a disastrous and cruel policy like this for 4 or 5 years can be utterly without consequence? What's your explanation? It's a really odd one, because I'm very lucky in that now the quality of people on Twitter who send me references and stuff is Incorrigible FCA started it all. The BBC have teams of researchers. Here it's just me and Beth, really, for a couple of hours before we come on air working out what we're going to talk about. Theo Usherwood will come over and say you should probably be doing this, but we don't. There's no one else. So Incorrigible FCA started sending me links and stuff a couple of years ago to help me understand stories and explain them better to you. And now quite a few of you have joined in, and I obviously I have to double check the sources a couple of times, but generally speaking, it's like citizen journalism, and this is from a tweeter who provides me with a lot of interesting stuff called Japan, Japa. NNE, and this is Simon Hughes speaking in October 2013. This is from Hansard. The link is clear, talking directly to Theresa May. He says, those of us who are willing to give the bill a second reading, this would be the 2014 immigration bill, and I am one of them, adds Simon Hughes, have concerns that there was no draft bill, no green paper and no white paper. These are the traditional stages towards becoming legislation that bills go through. There was a consultation only on part of the bill, and there are sensitive areas that need to be looked at across the board, including in connection with the legal aid changes. Here's the question Theresa May was asked by Simon Hughes towards the end of 2013 about the bill that became the Immigration Act 2014. Here's the question: why do we have to deal so quickly with such sensitive and difficult issues? In other words, why did it have to be forced through? And if you've got no idea how many people are here illegally, but you've set a target for how many people need to be removed voluntarily, and you've been told that some people are being adjudged to have no right to be here despite being part of the Windrush generation, and you carry on with these policies, I want you to explain it to me in a way that looks slightly less disgusting than it currently looks to me to be. Mehdi's in Tower Hamlets. Mehdi, what do you think?
Good morning, James. I just want to say, criticise, not Theresa May so much, but I want to criticise some of the Labour MPs that we have in the Labour rank. Far too often they're too heavily focused on criticising their leadership.
Well, how did you get through? We're talking about Theresa May and Amber Rudd presiding over absolute ignorance and policies, and I'm asking, how do you think it has happened?
I'm just coming to this, James. My point is this, that because she believes that anything possible, because their Labour Party...
I'm sorry, mate, I've got too many people waiting who are already clear about what they want to say. David is in Romford. David, what's going on?
Well, I haven't got a clue what's going on, but all I know, it's going to get a lot worse.
Why?
Is it going to get worse? Well, because it just reminds you of the days of slavery when families were being split up. I mean, this does sound a little bit horrific, but imagine it. You've got old lady dying of cancer, son trying to look after her. Who cares? You've got we've had all sorts of different accounts now of families being split up. What was their crime? You know, it's only going to get worse.
The crime. Let me, because I don't just want to share in confusion. The crime was to be unable to prove that they had a right to be here. The Home Secretary, Theresa May, was warned repeatedly, or her department was, we didn't have microphones in her office, warned repeatedly that people who had every right to be here, people who are British citizens under an act, I think that was passed in 1948, they had the right to be here, but they couldn't prove it. She was being warned that they were facing threats of removal. We know that some people under the threat of removal either left under their own steam rather than wait for a knock on the door, or lived in fear. And she knew it was going on. I don't, at this point, and my naivety has led me into trouble with regard to Theresa May. It may do with Amber Rudd. I don't think Amber Rudd had anything like the handle on these issues that Theresa May would have done, because Amber Rudd inherited it. Theresa May created it. And yet they carried on. And now she denies that there are targets when it's published. We've got a report from 2015 that says they did exist in 2015.
Yeah, well, this is it. And, I mean, Theresa May, when she was elected to office, we all remember her saying about black boys never getting these opportunities. Now, it just seems like...
She stood outside and talked about... it just looks very odd now. But...
No, yeah, that is what's really... That soundbite alone is as if it was designed. It was a designed soundbite, because when you look at... Does she really give a damn about...
I don't think she would, no, and I don't understand that. And this phrase voluntary removal, I'm not even entirely sure what that means. These people who've gone back to the West Indies for a wedding and then failed to be able to come back to Britain because of the rules that Theresa May brought in, do they count as having been voluntarily removed? Because if they're on the list and she's got this obsession with reducing numbers, that might explain why she could turn her conscience off.
Well, she goes to church, doesn't she?
Apparently, yeah. 10:27 is the time. Amen. George is in Potter's Bar. George, make me feel a bit better about this, because at the moment I'm 50% confused and 50% frightened.
You should be frightened. From what I've seen, a new government contract at the Home Office was awarded in 2013. So pushing through the legislation to support that makes more sense.
Well, let's not. I don't need to go too sort of deep on things that not everybody listening is going to understand.
Yeah.
So actually, first of all, tell me about your mum.
Oh, she's fine. She won't come. She hasn't got a passport. She's got her old passport, which has all the details in it. So when I phoned up Capita, they said that she'll be okay. She can apply for a biometric card. When I asked how long that would last, they said they don't know.
And how much would that cost?
They didn't say, and I didn't ask.
And this is the contract you're referring to, the fact that Capita now presides over a lot of these bureaucracies. So she's worried that, she can't leave the country on her Barbadian passport,
No,
so she's worried that if she did leave, she'd not be able to come back, even if she had a passport. She's been here since the 50s.
Yeah. She's been back once, because she's in the 70s. But she's never been back since, and I wanted to...
So what passport did she travel on then? One of those one-year ones?
No, it was a Barbadian.
Oh, okay, and that's...
She got it renewed.
Right.
And her indefinite stay was transferred from her original one. She came over in the 50s to her new one, but obviously that's expired. But she still got it, because I asked her, and that prompted me to phone to find out, because her status is unclear.
Right.
But she owns her own house. She's paid her tax.
And there's no way that Theresa May could be unaware of this. I mean, not just the 6 months of Amelia Gentleman's astonishing reporting in The Guardian, but increasing evidence of civil servants and charities telling the Home Office what was happening. And I suppose the kindest thing you could say is that these warnings didn't reach her. But now they have, and they're still denying. Am I being too kind again?
Oh, well, I personally think that they are aware, but they've awarded a contract to somebody who's got a target, and the interesting part of that was the targets now coming out. I think these third parties, you've got a target. You need to get rid of X amount of people.
Of course, because
Right.
presumably Capita's contract is measured and counted. They're not going to just get the bunch of money regardless of how many people leave the country.
And then the bonuses on those contracts are probably you make more, get rid of more people.
Well, we don't know that, and I'd be very surprised if that was written down anywhere. And I'm letting that go unchallenged, or not the last bit. I'm challenging the last bit, because in the absence of any better explanations, contracts given to these weird, massive companies like Carillion, which has gone under, and Capita, which hasn't. No proper scrutiny from the civil service, because it's gone kind of quasi-private. It's been privatised. Privatisation means payment according to targets and results. Home Office introduces targets and results. Home Secretary doesn't know about them. And you're supposed to be making me feel better. We're crossing live now to the House of Commons for this urgent question to the Home Secretary regarding the stuff we've been talking about.
I gave evidence about the Windrush generation at the Home Affairs Select Committee, about the people who contributed so much and who should never have experienced what they have. These people are here legally and should never have been subjected to any form of removal action. And as I told the Home Affairs Select Committee yesterday, I have seen no evidence that that has happened. Everyone in this House agrees that this group were here legally, but also that people who are here illegally should be treated different to legal migrants. And I am personally committed to tackling illegal migration because I have seen firsthand the terrible impact it has on the most vulnerable in our society. The exploitation and abuse which can come hand in hand with illegal migration. Yes. That's why my department has been working to increase the number of illegal migrants we remove. I have never agreed that there should be specific removal targets, and I would never support a policy that puts targets ahead of people. The immigration arm of the Home Office has been using local targets for internal performance management. These were not published targets against which performance was assessed, but if they were used inappropriately, then I am clear that this will have to change. I have asked officials to provide me with a full picture of performance measurement tools which are used at all levels and will update the House and the Home Affairs Select Committee as soon as possible.
Diane Abbott.
Another day, another revelation about the Windrush scandal. Yesterday, giving evidence to the Commons Home Affairs Select Committee, the Home Secretary said in terms, we don't have targets for removals. But the General Secretary of the Immigration Service Union told the committee earlier that there was a net removals target that enforcement teams had to meet, and they're aiming to remove a certain number of individuals in any given month. The General Secretary later confirmed that the target this month was 8,337, with targets on posters in regional centres. When Lord Carrington resigned over the Falklands, he said it was a matter of honour. Isn't it time that the Home Secretary considered her honour and resigned?
Home Secretary.
I would like to make the very clear distinction between legal and illegal migrants. And when the Right Honourable Lady talks about the Windrush cohort, we have already established that the Windrush cohort is here legally, and this government is determined to put that right, which is why I've put in the new measures to ensure that that happens. Yeah. I believe I have addressed the issue of targets, referring to the fact that there are some offices which are working with them. Unfortunately, I was not aware of them, and I want to be aware of them, which is why I'm now putting in place different measures to ensure that that happens.
Yeah. Sir Nicholas Soames.
That'll do, I think. Actually, let's hear what Nicholas Soames has to say. He's always good value.
That she has the total support of this side of the House. The total support of this side of the House in trying to resolve a very difficult legacy.
Thank you very much, Sir Nicholas. I forgot to tell you yesterday how he replied to my tweet about Jacob Rees-Mogg. I tweeted, Jacob Rees-Mogg said he might leave the country if the country abandons Brexit, so I pointed out that would depend on whether or not we still had full freedom of movement within the European Union. And Nicholas Soames, Winston Churchill's grandson, replied, he does these tortuously long hashtags. He replied, he said something like, don't forget to take Nanny with you. There's some division on the Tory benches. Right, this is weird now, because I love this job, you know I do, and over the last couple of years or a little bit longer, some people have been kind enough to suggest that we've managed to plough our own furrow when it comes to the news. Indeed, some have gone further and suggested that we've become an antidote to the overall environment of fake news, just for the 3 hours that we're on air. And today is one of those days where I don't know quite which direction to turn in, because I think Amber Rudd was just disingenuous on an industrial scale. You know, and I know, and she knows that people she just described as having every right to be here have been told over the last 4 years that they have no right to be here. You know that. I know that. She knows that. The whole point of the Windrush scandal is that people who have every right to be here, people who are as British as apple pie or Dick Van Dyke, people who have every right, people who are just here. They're just here. They're me. They're you. They've been told they have no right to be here. We've read the flipping letters. We've actually read the letters that have been sent to people from the Windrush generation. Those horrible, horrible letters. And now she's desperately trying to move the debate into legal versus illegal. And yet the whole point about the Windrush scandal is that people who had every right to be here were being told that they had to leave. So if you factor in the knowledge that people who had every right to be here were being told that they had to leave, and you factor in the knowledge that there were internal performance management targets, in other words, numbers on notice boards saying we need to get rid of this many this month, you've got a massive problem, haven't you? A problem that Amber Rudd is desperately trying to avoid. I still don't think this is her responsibility. I think it's Theresa May's. I think Diane Abbott is calling perhaps for the wrong head there. And I apologise in advance for upsetting the loyalists, but imagine if Yvette Cooper was actually the shadow Home Secretary. Imagine what she'd be doing over the dispatch box to Amber Rudd at the moment. That's a conversation for a different day, perhaps. But here's the thing. People who have every right to be here were being told that they had no right to be here. People with no right to be here were being removed according to targets. And you cannot separate those two things from each other. Because if you're desperate to meet a target, you are less likely to be troubled by the possibility that one of the removals that's going to help you meet the target might not be completely kosher. And they knew about this. They knew about it. And I thought it was right of Diane Abbott to remind us of Lord Carrington, the last cabinet minister to resign over failures in his department. Estelle Morris resigned as Education Secretary because, in a rare outbreak of political honesty, she didn't think she was up to the job. The task was beyond her. That's probably proof that she should have stayed, actually. It's these people like David Davis who think they're up to a job despite absolutely incontrovertible evidence that they're not really qualified to tie their own shoelaces. They're the politicians that frighten me. But anyway, that particular ship has sailed. But Lord Carrington, the last cabinet minister to resign over individual ministerial responsibility, and oddly Theresa May has quite strong views on this as well.
Yes, I think government has lost control of its immigration and asylum policy. Frankly, I think we see a degree of chaos in what is happening, and what is perfectly clear from what has taken place and been admitted by the government at the beginning of this week is that we have in this government ministers who simply don't know what is going on in their department. We have departments that deny the truth and have to have it dragged out of them. I find it extraordinary that a minister isn't willing just to step up to the plate and take the responsibility. Right. And it seems to me that you don't have to take a ministerial job, you don't have to take the car and the extra pay and so forth, but when you do, there is responsibility that has to be taken with it. And I'm actually sick and tired of government ministers who simply blame other people when something goes wrong and are not willing to take responsibility for what is happening under this government and their decisions.
10:42 is the time. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. So just to collect the information so far, targets were in place. The Home Secretary didn't know about them. They were introduced when the current Prime Minister was Home Secretary. When that Prime Minister was Home Secretary, meeting those targets would have been made a lot easier by describing people who had every right to be here as not having the right to be here. We've seen the letters they were sent. We know that the suffering that they've endured. It's been in The Guardian for 6 months. It's been all over the news for 10 days. And yet, as it stands, no one's joining the dots on that. And they're calling for Amber Rudd to resign for not knowing how bad the Home Office was under Theresa May. That's my view. What's yours? Marina is in Kensington. Marina, what do you think?
Yes, good morning, James. Thank you for taking my call. I'm very nervous speaking to you.
Oh, don't be.
Apart from the fact you're my favourite presenter, you're also extremely intelligent, articulate. I can go on forever.
No, I've told you not to ring me at work, Mum. You've got to stop ringing me at work like this. I'll phone you after the show. Carry on.
Basically, yeah, I didn't really know much about the Windrush situation. My daughter highlighted it to me. She signed a petition. Her husband's English, but his parents are Jamaican. But they have their passports. They have, they've been here for ages, generations. But basically, somebody else said to me that when you're deporting someone to the other side...
Just mind your phone, Marina, if you would. I just getting caught in the wind a bit. That's all right. Carry on.
Okay, can you hear me?
Loud and clear. Well, loud.
When somebody's being deported,
yes.
The other countries obviously have to accept these people. So I was told that they must have also known what was going on. And I'm just a little bit concerned.
Marina, you're so nice, and you said such lovely things about me, but your phone line's gone completely south. So I apologise for that. I think the point you make is that to claim ignorance is offensive. It's insulting. Ali's in Slough. Ali, what would you like to say?
Good morning, James. Ignorance is a convenient cover for people who are conniving, contrived, and in some cases downright dishonest. You mentioned Lord Carrington's resignation in the Falklands. Let's pick it up from there.
So did Diane Abbott, actually, to give her credit.
Ponting revealed that they were lying about the Belgrano and the sinking of the Belgrano.
Yeah, this is long after Carrington had left office.
That's right. The cash for questions, cash for fags, cash for access. You had the Al Yamama inquiry about downright corruption between the Saudis and Britain, which was shut down by Blair. Shoot to kill, the Stalker inquiry, ignoring paedophile abuse at Westminster, the poll tax fiasco, the granny tax.
Some of these examples are slightly relevant to the conversation we're having, but most of them aren't, mate.
Well, I'll tell you why they're relevant, James, because when people peddle things to be in the public interest and try and pull the wool over people's eyes, and the people wake up and say, hold on a second, there are two categories I've alluded to. One is dishonesty. Operation Flavius...
There was nothing dishonest about the poll tax. It was just a horrible policy that got kicked into touch by the public. I want to talk about Amber Rudd and Theresa May today, not Clive Ponting and General Belgrano.
Okay, then.
So do you think Amber Rudd... why are people calling for Amber Rudd to resign, given that every single thing that's happened under Theresa May's Home Secretary stewardship?
Well, I think she's the easier target. And the truth of this is that she's not going to resign easily because politicians...
Well, no one does anymore. No,
because there's no honour, there's no responsibility. And I said to you, the barrel is rotten. Rather than a rotten apple in a barrel, it's increasingly obvious that they keep lying, expecting the public of this country to accept their two-faced and three-faced and more-faced than Rubik's.
No, you see, you're doing that thing again. I mean, look, they're not all politicians. This is like UKIP type nonsense or Donald Trump drain the swamp type nonsense. Bad things happen. Most politicians are human. A few seem to be robotic. And retrospective 2020 hindsight is a wonderful thing.
Okay. Well,
explain to me, if you can, and I should be less frustrated with you for not being able to, because I can't either. Explain to me what you think happened at the Home Office, because that is all I am talking about today. I'm not talking about the Falklands War. I'm not talking about the poll tax. I'm not talking about the Al Yamama arms deal with Saudi Arabia that made Mark Thatcher a multi-millionaire. And the reason why I'm not talking about all of those things is because I don't have to and I don't want to. So what do you think happened at the Home Office?
The reason I mentioned those is dishonesty and is prevalent in many politicians. Now, with regard to this issue, immigrants have been bashed in this country for the best part of a decade and a half, manifestly. We didn't have this until...
So final chance, mate. What do you think happened at the Home Office?
They were deliberately doing this, and they've been caught with their hands in the till, so to speak.
And they thought they'd get away with it because of that backdrop of demonisation that we all recognise.
And the public in this country, thankfully, realised that this was a manifest injustice.
Well, for now they've realised it, because these, quotes, immigrants, end quotes, have got names and faces and stories, and you can only whip up the hatred when you've got hordes on posters that are unveiled hours before Joe Cox gets murdered by a racist, or you can talk about faceless people, or you can stick a news story with a number in it. That's how you get people to hate on humans, by pretending that they're somehow less than human. And the Windrush story has has brought home the simple humanity of our friends and neighbours to such a degree that you're right, the British public isn't going to put up with it. But the newspapers have hardly started, and that's what frightens me. It's 10:48. Problems here, Amber Rudd, actually, because it has happened on your watch. You didn't know that there were targets, and now you can see that there were. You've tried to dress them up as being a little bit different. What did you describe them as? Internal performance management. But there were targets. You said yesterday to the Select Committee that you didn't believe there were. So that's pretty... I'd have thought that was pretty serious. I'm being nudged towards the position that Theresa May has a case to answer, but Amber Rudd does as well. My suggestion that Amber Rudd is somehow carrying the can for Theresa May is losing water a little bit. I worry that Amber Rudd is getting targeted by the usual suspects because her Brexit credentials are sane and rational, and of course the owners of the major newspapers in this country want us to continue on the insane and irrational path to self-harm because they'll make money out of it. So really, if we were to be objective, we genuinely were to try to apply rules equally across the board, regardless, and this is the definition of unfashionable, isn't it? Regardless of our tribal loyalties or our binary positions, you can't defend either of them anymore. But British politics, democracy and accountability post-Brexit is so completely broken that I don't know that they will be held to it. Who decides? How can Amber Rudd be facing calls for her resignation while Boris Johnson personally imperilled a British citizen being held by a hostile state? How can any minister go while Boris Johnson still has a job? Patrick's in Eastbourne. Patrick, what's going on?
Morning, hello.
Hello, mate.
May I call you James?
Of course you may. That is my name, after all. What else were you toying with? What were the other contenders?
No, Mr. O'Brien.
Don't be daft, mate. You can call me mate if you want. I call most callers mate. What do you want to say, mate?
Well, I think what we, in my view, trying to make sense of the situation, which is difficult, is that I was a civil servant in the government department, the Department of Work and Pensions, in the job centre, for 27 years. And maybe I have got a bit of a personal beef to grind because, or axe to grind, I didn't get up the greasy pole or whatever.
Sure.
But I think what we have is a bit of a perfect storm, in as much as that we have very genuinely mediocre politicians across the board.
Yeah.
I don't think people have based it up for the job. I mean, if you had to almost even construct some sort of fantasy, like cabinet, you'll be very hard pushed to really find out.
Come up with a bigger bunch of spivs, charlatans and incompetents. I couldn't agree with you more.
In fairness, I do think local councillors and even, if you like, your constituent MPs are very good.
We are in purdah at the moment on council elections, so we can't really talk about anything. That you just give me the heebie-jeebies. It's the only Ofcom complaint I've ever had upheld, so carry on.
Anyway, but the point being is, one of the things I often say to anyone who's bothered to listen to me is that almost politics is too serious now to be left to the politicians.
Yeah.
We need to try and do what we can as the electorate, the people, to try and, make a difference.
Yeah, I mean, there's a touch of 'twas ever thus to this, but I agree with you. We do seem to have a particularly low calibre of politician at the moment. So talk me through, because I suspect I know what you're going to do. You're going to give me the kind of operational explanation of how this could have happened within the context of a big department like the one you used to work in. So give me that, if you would, Patrick.
Well, what it is that if you remember, the question about benefit sanctions.
Yeah.
Now, I must admit, speaking for someone who wasn't inside, I don't necessarily always think it's as black and white and as often it is portrayed in the media.
No.
But certainly what would happen is that, the government would say, we need to get tougher on, people signing on. We've got to make sure that, that they are really looking for work, and we need to be more rigorous about doing so. And what would happen as a sort of on the sort of coalface is that what would happen is the managers would sort of hear this policy, and then what would happen is that they would always construct it. And one of the things that happens in the civil service, I don't know where it happens elsewhere, is that there has been very much a climate of hear no evil, see no evil. It's almost a bit like when we used to have meetings, they never wanted anyone to pose any questions or challenge them, or even if they were trying to clarify.
I think that's true in a lot of workplaces. But here's the thing, and forgive me for pressing fast forward a bit. Even if this is a result of misguided managers doing what they thought was the best way to achieve what they'd been tasked with achieving, once the abuses start getting reported back to the politicians and the politicians do nothing, that's where culpability kicks in.
Sure. At the end of the day, it's obviously down to ministers. I'm not saying that Amber Rudd or, Theresa May shouldn't resign, but I do think there's also, as I said, a bit of a perfect storm where you have mediocre politicians underestimating also,
No, I hear you, but you've glossed over what I just said. When the complaints start reaching the politicians, when they start reaching the newspapers, as in this case they have done for the last 6 months, people who would have been included in these targets because they'd been told they had no right to remain, even though they did, then I'm afraid the old kind of incompetence or lions led by donkeys defence falls apart a bit, doesn't it?
Only as much as that what happens is that people often, like civil servants, if you've got performance pay, because you were talking about, the private companies.
Yeah, but I don't know about that yet. I'm only thinking out loud.
Pay is very much an integral part of the civil service these days. And what used to happen about sanctions is that people used to go for the low-hanging fruit. Often people would refer people who might have...
Bingo. But that's a result of the hostile environment, mate. That's not the result of incompetent politicians. Theresa May deliberately wanted a hostile environment.
I think she's a very mediocre politician.
That's very kind of you, Patrick, if you don't mind me saying so. I think that's very generous.
What happens is that politicians in particular, prominent politicians, underestimate people, the population, the electorate. And what we have is a situation where they think that they're doing the right thing or going to get votes out of it. And I said... I think people are much more sophisticated.
Well, I don't know yet. I hope you're right. I mean, Grenfell has broken something in me forever when I see how British people can respond to that sort of plight in such vile ways. Yeah, there's some crumbs of comfort to be gleaned from the suspicion that a lot of it's probably Russian bots just trying to make us all hate each other. But Grenfell gave me a lesson I'll never forget in whether or not we should underestimate or overestimate the British people. I think this policy doubled down on the belief that immigration had been so successfully toxified that no one would really care. But that speaks of racism on the part of the Windrush victims, doesn't it? It means that Theresa May looked at them and thought, sack it. Maybe some of them are being threatened with removal unfairly, but that'll help me meet the targets. And then you come back to this really grim conclusion that they knew what was happening and they just didn't care. And they're still vetting. They're still backing themselves to get away with it, because when push comes to shove, will the great British public really demand blood from politicians for the offence of coming down too hard on immigrants? Even if they have been here for 40 or 50 years. Right now, it looks like the great British public won't put up with this. But I have to tell you, given the changes to the great British public that have been undertaken during this toxification of immigration, during this fetishisation of xenophobia, I don't know. It depends what happens next, doesn't it? It depends what happens next. Is anyone... I don't know, even if the nastiest examples of mainstream racism in this country were to stand up and say they're not really... I mean, Enoch Powell would, wouldn't he? Because that was the whole point of his speech. He would say that the Windrush people shouldn't be here because they'll end up with the whip hand. And there are some grubby little chancers who speak of their admiration for Enoch Powell. And I guess some of them have made it into the mainstream. But I don't know. I love my country and my people too much to think that they could be turned into vessels of hatred, even against those who've lived alongside them for 40 or 50 years. What an absolute mess. I could talk about this all day, but I've got nothing else to say. And of course, I think I'm at my worst as a phone-in host when I ask you to ring me and explain stuff to you that I can't understand myself, and then get frustrated with you for not being able to provide a clarity of analysis that I've spent an hour explaining I haven't got myself. It looks horrible to me. Absolutely horrible, this. And it is, I think, increasingly clear that the hostile environment Theresa May claimed was confined to illegal immigrants under her premiership has been extended to everybody from the disabled to victims of rape. You'll remember that, what's her chops? That dreadful woman you took over George Osborne's old. Esther McVeigh was attempting recently to explain to victims of rape that having to relive their ordeal with a benefits assessor in order to, if they decided to have the baby that had been conceived as a result of rape, they would have to explain to a benefits assessor, if that was their third child, why they should be exempted from the ban upon child benefit for third and above children. Esther McVeigh tried to describe it as an opportunity, as a plus, as a positive. Hostile environment for everybody eventually. That's how it works, isn't it? But anyway.